So after World War One, while Europe had a longer road to recovery because that's where the war was fought, and they had fought there for so many years, the United States things looked actually pretty good. The period after World War One is often called the Gilded Age. Now the thing to keep in mind about something being gilded means that it's coated in gold on the outside. Underneath, maybe not so great, and that pretty well describes the American economy. It was prosperous, and there was a lot of economic growth, but there were a lot of flaws kind of underneath the surface. One problem was poor distribution of wealth. Um, so this is a period when a lot of the sort of modern American consumer life was born. You had production of new things like cars and refrigerators and washing machines and all these new consumer products. And they're being produced in these factories. Well, most people in the U.S. at this point had either agricultural or factory jobs. People working in those factories actually usually couldn't have produced the goods, or sorry, afford to purchase those goods. This is also the period of consumer credit. So if you can't afford to buy the washing machine, you take a loan out, and then you buy that washing machine. Well, of course, eventually this sort of catches up, and a lot of these workers can't afford to pay back their debts or buy new things. Of course, if people buy less things, then the factory ends up producing less. The factory produces less, they allow more workers, fewer workers can buy those goods, and you get sort of this cycle, which means that people on the lower end of society, the working class, they're not able to buy all these great new things, and it starts to drive the economy down a little bit. Um, Farms were more productive than ever during this period. They're growing so much wheat and so much corn and so much livestock. The problem is, again, think supply and demand. When you overproduce a good, its value drops. So while these farmers go to market with tons and tons and tons of grain, uh, no one's going to buy it for a price that actually makes them productive, which means that the profits for farms really actually dropped. Many farmers end up having to close their farms and sell off their land to larger producers. Um, the stock market really took off in this time period. Um, and the way that people often bought stocks seemed like a good idea, but maybe wasn't. It's called buying stocks on margin. Let's say I want to buy a stock, but I don't have enough to buy as much as I want. So I go to my stockbroker and say, okay, I want to buy stocks in Ford or whatever, but I can only afford this much. Stockbroker would say, no problem, I'm going to give you a small loan. You just pay a small portion of the cost of the stocks, and then in a few years, as of course the stocks are going to skyrocket and gain a lot of wealth, you can sell the stock and pay back the loan with some interest to me. And in theory, everybody wins. The stock goes up. The guy who bought the stocks makes a profit because the value went up. The guy who sells the stocks makes a profit because he gets interest on the loan. Sounds great, but it really relies on the stocks constantly increasing. And in the 20s, that seemed like it's going to happen, that you wouldn't really have a significant drop off in the stock market. That's what's often called the roaring 20s, like you see on the chart. The value just kept going up and up and up. And keep in mind, the understanding of the economy was still developing. We know now things like recessions and depressions and that sort of thing, but the exact understanding of how stock markets work, because they're relatively new, at least on the scale, the industrial style stock market, people didn't actually know what exactly was going to happen. Now, they figured you might have dips and drops, and in September of 1929, investors expected that, okay, we've kind of reached a peak, there's probably going to be a drop before things recover again. So some investors started selling their stocks, which is sort of what you do before the stock loses its value, so you can gain a profit on it. Well, as we moved into October, on Thursday, October 11th, 1929, there was a sudden drop in the stock market. And this caused a lot of the investors to panic and really sell as many stocks as they could. And this started sort of a free fall. October 29th, 1929, which is called Black Tuesday on the stock market. 16 million shares of stocks were sold. None of them were bought. The market basically collapsed. And keep in mind that when we talk about stock markets in the 1920s, it's not like today where all this would happen online. I mean, people were literally running to Wall Street to sell their stocks. And people who had their money tied up in savings bonds or other accounts like that, they would run to their banks and say, I need to get all my money out now before it loses its value. The problem was a bank doesn't have as much cash on hand for everyone to take their money out. So people would run on the banks, take out all their money, bank would run out of money, and then they basically just close. And so if you had your life savings in some of those banks, now it's gone. This is before insurance for banks developed. This is when most banks were small and local. And this is the economic collapse that becomes what we call the Great Depression. It started in the U.S., but when the U.S. has this economic collapse, they call up Europe and say, hey, remember all that money we loaned you in World War I that you've been slowly paying back? Well, you need to pay back all of it now because we're out of money. European countries said we can't afford to do that. We need to increase taxes on foreign goods. Let's have more tariffs. When you have higher tariffs, global trade drops. I'm talking about a massive drop, 65%. And soon the whole world kind of gets caught up in this cycle of economic depression. This is one of the worst economic events in history, and certainly modern history. While we think of the Great Depression as really bad in the United States, and it was, in a lot of ways it was worse in Europe, because remember, Europe is still trying to rebuild from World War I. The responses of governments around the world really varied. In the United States, you had the creation of the New Deal, where the government basically said, okay, people need jobs, let's give them a job. Here's a shovel, go build a dam, go build a new park, go build a post office. Arguably, these New Deal jobs fixed the economy. Some historians and economists still say that it was really more the Second World War that did it. Economics is sort of a weird science in that way. It's kind of hard to pin exactly what saved the U.S. economy. But by World War II, it does recover. In Britain and France, the different sides of the government created these coalition governments where they worked together. They regulated the economy. They controlled the price of some goods. They controlled inflation. Both Britain and France develop sort of the modern welfare state. By welfare state, we mean public health care, public savings, and Social Security, and those sort of networks that still exist today. In Scandinavian countries like Norway and Denmark, they turned more towards socialist programs, where the government took control of things like stocks and industries, especially things like healthcare and housing. And those governments still today sort of rely on those things. So gradually, by the time we get to the late 30s and into the early 40s, most of the economy recovers. But this moves us into the Second World War. So while the U.S. and Britain and France and Scandinavia create these more sort of democratic and stabilizing governments to fix the Great Depression, in other places like Germany and Italy and Spain, they turn more towards radical dictators, as you'll see in another